The rain had been falling since before dawn, the kind that isn't heavy enough to flood the streets, but never stops, seeping into everything, turning the whole world a shade darker. My house, an aging single story on the east side of Portland, was quiet except for the soft hum of the fridge and the faint creak of the roof settling. I stood at the kitchen window, coffee mug in my hands, watching the drizzle blur the backyard fence until it looked like something out of an old photograph. That's when my eyes landed on the envelope sitting on the counter. It had been there since last night. Thick cream paper, a little heavier than your standard bill or junk flyer. My son's handwriting was centered on the front in neat, deliberate strokes. Daniel Whitaker. I'd recognized it instantly, even after months without a word. For a moment, I let myself imagine what might be inside. Maybe an invitation to his wedding after all this time, something formal and heartfelt. Maybe a line or two about how he'd been thinking, about how he wanted to patch things up before his big day. The fantasy was ridiculous, but I let it live for just a few seconds before I slid into the chair, set my coffee down, and broke the seal. The sound of tearing paper seemed loud in the stillness. I expected to see an embossed card, maybe with a gold border, announcing the date and location. Instead, a stack of documents slid onto the table. Invoices. Each one was crisp and professionally formatted, the kind of paperwork you could hand to a bank. I picked up the first page, my eyes scanning the bold numbers. Willow Crest Estate, Sonoma Valley, $42,000 for a weekend rental. La Belle Cuisine, $18,000 for catering, including imported wine and Maine lobster. Starlight Photography, $7,500 for a New York-based photographer's exclusive package. Kauai Bliss Resort, $12,500 for a honeymoon bungalow with spa access and private beach. At the bottom, in Daniel's small, precise handwriting, "Dad, after all the trouble you've caused this family, you should be grateful I'm letting you contribute. This is your share. Please send the check soon. Maya and I are counting on it." I read it again and again. Grateful. Trouble. The words clanged in my head like steel doors slamming shut. Trouble meant the years after his mother died, when I was holding the house together on my modest engineering salary and whatever extra shifts I could pick up. Trouble meant working late, skipping vacations, selling the boat I'd saved for just to cover the hospital bills. Trouble meant he didn't get the shiny, picture-perfect life he thought he was owed. My eyes drifted to the framed photo on the wall. Daniel at 9 years old, his baseball uniform a size too big, grinning with a gap where his front tooth had been knocked loose. I was beside him in the shot, my hand on his shoulder, the glove dangling from my other hand. I remembered the sweat on his neck, the way he'd leaned into me as we walked off the field, the way he looked at me like I was someone who could fix anything. Somewhere along the way, that boy had vanished. I sat back in my chair, the invoices spread in front of me. At first, the anger came hot, boiling under my skin, making my breath short. But I've been angry before. Angry at bosses who took credit for my work, at doctors who spoke to me in numbers and jargon instead of plain truth, at life itself for taking my wife before we'd had the chance to grow old together. I knew better than to let it control me, so I let the heat cool. I let it condense into something sharp and cold, something I could hold without it burning my hand. $80,000. That was more than my mortgage, more than I had left in the account I'd been carefully padding for years so I could finally retire without fear. And Daniel, my own son, had decided to exclude me from his wedding, then send me the bill as if I'd be honored just to be allowed to pay for it. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. He didn't know me anymore. He thought I'd either fold or lash out. But there was a third option, one he'd never expect. I stood, the chair legs scraping against the worn wood floor, and crossed the kitchen to the cabinet where my old laptop sat. It was a beat-up silver model from the early 2010s, its surface scratched and dull. I brushed off a fine layer of dust and set it on the table. When the screen flickered to life, it felt like lighting a fuse. Daniel had his social media locked down tight, but Maya, his fiancée, was another story. Her pages were public, curated down to the last filter. Brunches in Napa, charity events in floor-length gowns, hashtags like living or best life and Hanan wedding countdown. It didn't take long to find the date. November 9th, 2025. Willow Crest Estate. The estate's website was full of soft focus photos. Vineyards stretching into the distance. French doors opening onto sweeping balconies. A ballroom with chandeliers like frozen waterfalls. The price tag matched the invoice to the dollar. Her posts were a roadmap. Every vendor tagged. Every luxury noted. A florist in San Francisco. A jazz quartet. A bakery specializing in hand-painted cakes. Even their honeymoon booking was tagged in a story about self-care before the big day. I sat back and sipped my coffee. They'd left the door wide open. All I had to do was step through. Confronting Daniel directly would be useless. He'd twist it into another lecture about how I'd failed him, how I didn't understand his world. No, this would require patience. A slow, deliberate dismantling. That's when a name came to me. Eli Carter. Eli had been Daniel's best friend back in high school. I remembered the two of them spending whole summers shooting hoops in the driveway or working on Eli's beat-up old Chevy. Then Daniel got into a prestigious East Coast school and stopped returning Eli's calls. Last I'd heard, Eli was running a private investigation business out of Sacramento. I still had his number. I dialed before I could second-guess myself. Hello? The voice was deeper now, but there was no mistaking it. Eli, it's Robert Whitaker, Daniel's dad. A pause, then a dry laugh. Well, this is a surprise. What's the occasion? It's complicated. Daniel's getting married next month. I'm not invited. But he sent me an $80,000 bill for the wedding and honeymoon. I want to make sure things don't go the way he's planning. Another pause. That sounds like him. Let's talk. That diner on Hawthorne by 39th. Still there? Still there. Meet me in an hour. The rain was steady as I pulled into the diner's lot. Inside, the place smelled like coffee and bacon grease, same as it had 20 years ago. Eli was already in a booth, a camera bag at his feet. He looked older, leaner, hair shorter, but the eyes were the same, sharp, observant. We shook hands, and I slid into the seat opposite him. Over steaming mugs of coffee, I laid out the whole thing. I didn't spare details, and Eli didn't interrupt much, though I could see the tightness in his jaw. I'll help, he said finally. Not just for you, for me too. He burned me years ago. Left me holding the bag on a job we promised to finish together. You tell me what you need, and I'll get it. We talked for nearly an hour. Eli suggested starting with the vendors, seeing which ones were already uneasy, which contracts had weak points. He could be on site in Sonoma the week before, taking photos, recording conversations, documenting anything that could be used as leverage. By the time I drove home, I felt lighter than I had in months. The rain had eased to a mist, and the city smelled like wet concrete and cedar. That night, Eli showed up at my house with a small duffel. Inside were a discreet audio recorder, 2 palm-sized cameras, and an app I could install on my phone to record calls. Oregon's a one-party consent state, he said. If they call you while you're here, it's all fair game. The important thing is, let them talk. Don't give them a reason to shut down. We practiced until muscle memory took over. I could slide the recorder into my pocket and hit the button without looking. I could open the app mid-sentence without missing a beat. The first call came the next morning. Not from Daniel, from Maya. "Robert," she began, her tone so sweet it almost masked the steel underneath. "We heard from Willowcrest that your payment hasn't come through yet. Daniel said it's probably just a mix-up. Could you take care of it today? We'd really hate for this to become an issue." I let her words sink in. I didn't argue. I didn't agree. I just listened, letting the recorder in my pocket do its work. When she hung up, I poured myself another cup of coffee and looked out at the wet street. The first piece of the puzzle was in place, and I was just getting started. By the next morning, the clouds had broken, leaving the streets shining under a pale November sun. Portland always looks different after a night of rain, like someone took the whole city and rinsed the dust off. But the light didn't do much to change what I saw in front of me. A son who thought I was nothing but a line item in his wedding budget, and a set of invoices that felt more like insults than requests. Eli texted me before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. "We should talk vendors today. Paper trails are where cracks start to show." I didn't need convincing. If there was one thing I'd learned in engineering, it was that every structure, no matter how solid, has a stress point. Apply pressure in the right place, and the whole thing comes apart. I called him back. "Where do we start?" I asked. "With the ones who are already nervous," he said. "If Maya's posting every detail online, I can guarantee at least a few of these people are overextended or underpaid. And if the big payment's not in their account yet, they get jumpy," I finished. "Exactly." We agreed to meet at my place in an hour. While I waited, I pulled the invoices out again, laying them in a neat row on the kitchen table. Each one was a story in itself, a glimpse into how much Maya and Daniel cared about appearances. Imported lobster for 150 guests. Champagne sourced directly from France at $240 a bottle. Custom monogrammed napkins from a company in New York. It was excess for the sake of excess. When Eli arrived, the November chill came in with him. He wore a windbreaker and carried a laptop bag, his camera slung casually over one shoulder. We didn't waste time. He spread out his own notes beside mine, matching names from the invoices with screenshots from Maya's social media. "This," he said, pointing to one vendor name, "is your first weak point. The florist. Small outfit in San Francisco, upscale but not flush with cash. A delay in payment could tank them for the month." He moved to another name. "The Jazz Quartet, local to Napa. They've got 2 other gigs that weekend. If they think they're getting stiffed, they'll walk." We built the list together, marking each vendor's potential vulnerabilities. The honeymoon resort was prepaid, which meant we couldn't touch it directly, but the rest was still in play. By noon, we had a map of the wedding's moving parts and the threads we could pull. Eli leaned back in his chair. "Now, I can call around quietly, pretend I'm confirming delivery schedules, see what I can stir up. But for maximum effect," he glanced at me, "they need to hear from you." "Me? You're the one they think is paying. If you even hint that something's wrong, it'll set off alarms." I wasn't sure how I felt about making those calls myself. But then I remembered the note at the bottom of the invoice. "You should be grateful I'm letting you contribute." Fine. I'd contribute to their chaos. We started with the florist. The phone rang twice before a woman's voice answered, breathless and harried. "Bloom and Vine. This is Carla." "Carla," I said, adopting a calm, matter-of-fact tone. This is Robert Whitaker. My son Daniel hired you for his wedding in November. I'm the one covering the payment." "Oh, yes, Mr. Whitaker. We've been in touch with the planner. Everything's—" "That's why I'm calling," I cut in gently. "There's been some discussion about scaling back. The payment schedule might change." A pause. "I see. I'll know more in a week. In the meantime, I'd hold off on ordering any specialty imports. No sense in wasting resources if the order changes." She promised to make a note, but I could hear the worry creeping in. We moved down the list, each call planting a different kind of seed. Uncertainty, the catering company, the photographer, even the limo service. Always the same script: payment delays, possible downsizing, changes to the guest list. By the time we'd finished, it was mid-afternoon, the low autumn light cutting long shadows across my kitchen table. "You realize," Eli said, "if they call Daniel, he's going to know something's up." "Good," I said. "That's the point." We didn't have to wait long. That evening, around 6, my phone lit up with Daniel's name. I let it ring twice before answering, the recorder already running in my pocket. "Dad," he said without preamble, "why are you calling vendors? Mark, my planner, just told me half of them are freaking out." "I had questions," I said evenly. "If I'm expected to write a check that large, I have a right to understand where it's going." "You're making us look unprofessional. These people are high-end. They don't deal with this kind of nonsense. Maybe they shouldn't book weddings they can't afford without other people's money?" Silence. Then, sharper. "Don't start with that. You owe me for the years I had to scrape by because you couldn't give Mom the life she deserved." There it was, the same knife he'd used before. I didn't flinch. I gave her everything I had, including the years that should have been ours after you grew up. "You think this is about money? It's about respect. And right now, you're embarrassing me in front of everyone." "Respect works both ways, Daniel. You cut me out of your wedding and sent me a bill like I'm your bank. That's not respect. That's arrogance." His voice was tight when he finally said, "If you're not going to help, just say so." "I'm not going to help," I said, and I hung up. The silence afterward was thick, but it wasn't heavy. It was clean. Eli, who'd been sitting across from me, grinned. "You just kicked the first leg out from under the table." The next day, the ripple effect started showing. The florist emailed Daniel's planner asking for a revised payment timeline. The limo service put their reservation on hold pending confirmation. Even the photographer, apparently a bit of a diva, emailed Maya directly to say she wouldn't hold the date without a firm deposit. And through it all, I didn't hear a word from Daniel. But I knew that silence wouldn't last. By Friday, the first text came. "We need to talk now." I didn't respond. By Saturday, there were 3 voicemails. His tone shifted from irritated to panicked. And by Sunday evening, Maya herself called again, her voice sharpened to a blade. "Robert, you have no idea the damage you're causing. People are talking. We've had to reassure the estate 3 times this week. Daniel is under enormous stress, and this is not the time for whatever vendetta you think you're running." I let her finish, then said, "If Daniel wants to talk, he can call me himself. Until then, the money stays where it is." "You're making a huge mistake," she snapped. "Maybe," I said, and hung up. Eli and I met again that night. His updates were exactly what I wanted to hear. Vendors wobbling, timelines shifting, the whole machine starting to grind against itself. "You've got momentum now," he said. "Push a little harder, and they'll be spending the week putting out fires instead of polishing champagne flutes." I looked at the invoices one more time, the neat black type and perfect margins. They'd expected me to just sign the check, no questions asked. Instead, I was signing the opening chapter of their unraveling. And the best part? We hadn't even touched the big piece yet. The first real sign that the tide was turning came on a Tuesday morning. I was halfway through making breakfast, eggs over easy, toast a little darker than most people like, when Eli sent me a text. "Check your email. You'll like this." I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened my laptop. There it was. A forwarded email from the Willowcrest Estates event coordinator to Daniel's planner. It was polite, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. "Dear Mr. Peters, we've received several inquiries from vendors about the payment schedule for the Whitaker Cruise wedding. While we understand certain arrangements are still being finalized, we must remind you that the balance is due no later than October 30th to guarantee services. Best regards, Cassandra Holt." It was the first time I'd seen Maya's last name in writing. Cruise. It somehow made the whole thing feel more formal, more official, like reading a line from a contract. I called Eli. "Where'd you get this?" "A contact at the estate," he said casually. "Turns out if you buy enough drinks for the right people, they talk." I could hear the grin in his voice. "Vendors are gossiping," he went on. "They're saying the groom's dad is withholding payment because he's not invited. By the time it makes the rounds, it'll be, the wedding might be canceled because the family's at war." I let out a low breath. Perfect. Eli wasn't done. "I also have something else. Audio from the florist. I didn't even have to push. She called me after you spoke to her, said she's never worked a high-end wedding where the payer was this hands-on. I just let her talk. Here, listen." The recording crackled to life. Carla, the florist, her voice pitched low like she was sharing a secret. "I don't know, Eli. Something's off about this one. The dad says he's the one paying, but the couple won't talk to him. And they want peonies in November, flown in from New Zealand? That's insane. I might not even get paid at this rate." I smiled to myself. Vendors don't like risk. And right now, Daniel and Maya were starting to look risky. That afternoon, I decided it was time to widen the circle. Not the public, not yet, but the people who mattered. The inner ring, extended family, old friends, anyone Daniel and Maya would be desperate to impress. I started with my sister, Karen. She lives in Spokane, hasn't seen Daniel in years, but she knows exactly how to work a phone tree. "Robert," she said, after I told her the broad strokes, "you mean to tell me he's cutting you out of the wedding but expects you to pay for the whole thing?" "That's about it," I said. There was a sharp inhale. "Well, that's not going to stay quiet for long." "That's the idea," I said. By dinner, Karen had called me back twice with updates. An old neighbor in Tacoma couldn't believe what she was hearing. A cousin in Boise was concerned about the couple's priorities. I didn't have to push. I just had to let the story walk on its own legs. The next day, Daniel finally cracked. The call came in just after 9 a.m. His name lit up my phone, and I hit record before I even said hello. "Dad, what the hell are you doing?" His voice was tight, clipped. "People are calling me about rumors. Vendors are asking if the wedding's even happening." "Maybe you should talk to your vendors then," I said. "Don't play games. This is my wedding, not yours. You can't just—" "I'm not playing games," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm making a point. You can't cut me out of your life and still expect me to finance it. You're making us look like idiots." "You don't need my help for that," I said. There was a long pause. Then he hung up. Eli showed up later that afternoon, looking like the cat that caught the canary. He dropped a USB stick on my table. "What's this?" "Security cam footage from the estate. My contact there pulled it for me." We plugged it into my laptop. The grainy black and white video showed Daniel and Maya in the estate's main hall, arguing with someone I assumed was Cassandra, the coordinator. Maya's arms were crossed, Daniel was gesturing sharply, and Cassandra looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. "You can't hear much," Eli said, "but you don't need to. This is optics." They wanted an image of effortless elegance. Now there's literal footage of them bickering in the venue like customers at a return counter. I stared at the looping video. "Can we make sure the right people see this?" Eli grinned. "Already handled." That night, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and sat at the kitchen table, listening to the rain start up again outside. My phone buzzed. Another voicemail from Maya. I didn't even listen to it. Instead, I thought about the years I'd spent swallowing my pride for Daniel's sake, the overtime hours, the things I'd sold to cover bills, the way I'd let him rewrite history so he could feel justified in looking down on me. Not anymore. We were past the point of repair. Now, it was about teaching him what happens when you treat people like tools instead of blood. The next morning, Eli texted me again. "Got a bite. Caterers threatening to walk if they don't get the deposit by Friday. Also, rumor is the quartet's looking for another gig that weekend." I could almost hear the ticking of an invisible clock. We didn't have to destroy the wedding in one blow. All we had to do was make sure that by the time November 9th rolled around, the cracks were too deep to hide. And we were well on our way. By the time the first week of November rolled around, the air in Portland had that sharp edge that cuts right through your coat. The mornings were fog-heavy, the kind where the world feels muffled, as if the sound has been soaked up by the mist. I woke up that Monday with the same thought I'd been having for days. Daniel and Maya weren't just bleeding vendors now, they were bleeding credibility. All that was left was to make sure the right people saw the blood. Eli called just after breakfast. "We've got an opening," he said, skipping pleasantries. "Maya's maid of honor? Her name's Kelsey. She's not as loyal as you'd think." "How do you know that?" I asked. "Because she was at the estate last weekend when Daniel had his little meltdown in front of Cassandra. She told a friend, who told me, that she's embarrassed to be associated with all this. Says Maya's become, her words, not mine, a nightmare." I couldn't help the small, dry laugh that escaped. "And what does she want in exchange for talking?" "Nothing. She just wants to vent. And she doesn't realize yet who she's venting to." Eli had arranged to meet her under the guise of clarifying some timeline questions for the photographer. By the time they were done, he had 20 minutes of audio, her voice spilling over with frustration. "She's micromanaging everything," Kelsey said on the recording. "But the funny part is, they can't even pay their own bills. It's all on his dad. And apparently, they're not even inviting him? Like, who does that? Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if half these vendors walked." It was perfect. Pure, unfiltered testimony from someone on the inside. I spent that afternoon thinking about the best way to use it. Posting it online would be too obvious. It needed to spread quietly, like smoke slipping under a door. So I started with people I knew Daniel respected, or at least wanted to impress. A couple of his former mentors from his tech days, an investor he'd been courting for months. All it took was a short, careful email. "Thought you might want to hear this before committing to working with Daniel on anything." Just passing it along. I didn't need to say more. The audio did the work. By Wednesday, Eli was hearing back from his contacts that Daniel's professionalism was being questioned in certain circles. The investor canceled a lunch. The mentor sent a vague text about timing not being right. Every cancellation was another brick out of the wall Daniel thought was holding him up. Meanwhile, the vendors were teetering. The florist was reevaluating commitments. The The caterer had sent 2 formal requests for payment. And the jazz quartet? Gone. They booked another gig in Napa for the same night. Maya must have been furious, because she called me late that night. "Robert," she started, her voice sugary but shaking. "I understand you're upset. I understand there's history. But you need to think about how this is affecting us. This is our wedding." "You should have thought about that before you cut me out," I said. "That was Daniel's decision," she said quickly. "He thought it would be less stressful for you. But we still wanted you to be part of it, in your way." "My way," I repeated, "meaning my money." She didn't answer right away. "You've always said you wanted Daniel to have the best. Why stop now?" I took a long breath, letting the silence stretch. Because I realized giving him the best wasn't the same as teaching him to value it. There was a tiny, sharp exhale on her end. Not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff. "You're making a mistake." "I'm making a point," I said, and hung up. Eli showed up the next day with another gem. This time it was a photo, snapped discreetly during a vendor meeting at the estate. Daniel was leaning over the table, jabbing a finger toward Cassandra, his face twisted with irritation. Maya was beside him, arms crossed tight, her eyes narrowed. "Body language tells the whole story," Eli said. "This isn't the couple people want to work with. And if the estate starts thinking they're difficult clients, they'll stop giving them leeway." We sent that photo to 2 people, the estate's owner and Daniel's old college roommate, who now worked as a reporter for a regional lifestyle magazine. No caption, no explanation, just the image. By Friday, I started hearing from neighbors. One of them, Alice, who lived 3 doors down, caught me while I was getting the mail. "Robert, I heard about the situation," she said, lowering her voice like it was a spy novel. "It's a shame, really. All that money, and they can't even treat their own family right." I gave a small shrug. Some lessons are expensive. That night I poured a bourbon and sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own breathing. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was reacting to Daniel's moves. I was setting the board. The next morning, Eli called with urgency in his voice. "The caterer's out, just pulled the plug. Too much uncertainty." It was happening faster than I thought. By Sunday, there were whispers about the wedding being scaled down or postponed. I knew better. What Daniel and Maya were watching wasn't a scaling down. It was the slow collapse of a tower they'd built on borrowed money and borrowed respect. And I was the one loosening the bolts. The first real public crack came in a place Daniel never thought he'd lose control. The wine-tasting gala at the Portland Art Museum. I hadn't been invited, of course, but Eli had a contact in the catering staff. That's how I got the call that night, around 8. "You'll want to see this," Eli said. "Daniel's here with Maya. It's not going well." An hour later, I was sitting in Eli's car across from the museum, watching through the windshield as clusters of well-dressed guests drifted down the steps, coats pulled tight against the November chill. Eli handed me his phone, a video already queued up. Daniel stood near the bar, a half-empty glass of red wine in one hand, the other gesturing too sharply at a man in a charcoal suit. Maya was beside him, her smile stretched thin, like it had been painted on. The man looked uncomfortable, nodding too much, trying to de-escalate whatever Daniel was on about. "He's arguing about a donation pledge," Eli said. "The guy's on the board of a non-profit Daniel's been sniffing around for connections. Apparently, the pledge was contingent on a certain reputation for stability." I didn't have to guess what had shaken that stability. The ripples from our vendor calls and leaked recordings had reached farther than I'd expected. The video wasn't explosive, no shouting, no physical confrontation, but it was enough. You could see the tension in Daniel's jaw, the stiffness in Maya's shoulders, the way nearby guests were trying to pretend they weren't watching. Eli smirked. "I've already sent it to 2 people who'll make sure it finds the right audience." I didn't ask who. I didn't need to know. By the next morning, Daniel called. I let it go to voicemail. "Dad, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're burning bridges for me. People I've worked with for years are suddenly questioning my judgment. This is ridiculous. Just stop." There was no apology in his voice, no acknowledgement, just the same entitlement, dressed in different words. I saved the message. That afternoon, I got another update from Eli, this one from the Willowcrest estate itself. Cassandra, the coordinator, had been overheard telling her assistant she wouldn't be surprised if the whole thing fell apart before the 9th. Hearing that was satisfying, but it also made me pause. The 9th was only days away now. If I kept pushing at this pace, there might not be a wedding to sabotage. It might collapse entirely before the day arrived, and part of me wondered, did I want that? I sat with the question that night, bourbon in hand, watching the rain bead and roll down the window. If the wedding imploded now, Daniel would blame me forever. He might anyway, but at least if it happened on the day, in front of the people he'd tried so hard to impress, the lesson would be sharper. I decided to hold back, just slightly. Not to save them, but to make sure the collapse happened where it would cut deepest. In the meantime, I kept feeding the slow drip. Eli arranged for the florist to accidentally double-book part of her staff for another event the same weekend. We didn't cancel her outright. We just made sure she'd be stretched thin, unable to give Maya the lush, over-the-top arrangements she'd bragged about online. The caterer's exit had already forced them to scramble for a replacement. The only one they could get on short notice was a local company that specialized in farm-to-table comfort food. Good quality, but nowhere near the French cuisine Maya had been posting about for months. On Thursday, Eli sent me another recording. This one was from a meeting between Daniel, Maya, and the new caterer. "We can do roasted chicken or braised short ribs," the caterer was saying. "Both are crowd pleasers." Maya's voice was tight. "We were expecting filet mignon and lobster tails. This is supposed to be an elegant evening." Daniel jumped in. "We're paying you a lot of money. I think you can figure out how to make it work." The caterer's response was polite but firm. "Not without more notice and more budget." Eli's voice over the recording. "You can practically hear the blood pressure rising." That night, I replayed the audio twice. Not because I needed to, but because it reminded me how different Daniel sounded when the balance of power wasn't in his favor. The next day, Friday, I got a call from Karen in Spokane. "You won't believe this," she said, a little too cheerfully. "A friend of mine saw Daniel at a networking breakfast this morning. Apparently, someone made a joke about him not inviting his father to the wedding, and he didn't take it well." "What happened?" He knocked over his coffee, stormed out. I could picture it perfectly. The stiff shoulders, the muttered curse, the eyes scanning the room to see who was watching. Saturday came, and with it, one last piece from Eli before the wedding week began. He'd gotten his hands on the final guest list. It was smaller than I expected, a sign they'd already been cutting. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. "Nothing," I said. "Not yet." Because in 2 days, we'd be in the home stretch. And I wanted to make sure the final act wasn't just a collapse. It was a spectacle. I went to bed that night with the rain still falling, the sound steady and relentless against the roof. In less than a week, Daniel's perfect day would arrive, and I'd be ready to make sure it was anything but. The Monday before the wedding broke with a brittle kind of sunlight, the kind that makes everything look sharper, but colder too. Portland felt like it was holding its breath. I couldn't tell if that was the weather or just me. By now, the sabotage wasn't just momentum, it was gravity. Vendors were sliding away, friends were cooling off, and Daniel was doing everything he could to keep the facade from cracking in public. I knew that because Eli was feeding me a steady diet of updates from his people on the ground. At 8 sharp, he called. "They're in triage mode," he said without greeting. "Florists short on staff, caterers still holding a grudge, and the estate's starting to talk penalties." "Oh, and Maya?" "She's in meltdown territory. My source says she was in tears on the phone with her sister yesterday." I leaned back in my chair, coffee in hand. "Good. That means they're distracted." "Exactly. Which means this is the week to plant the last landmines." We met at my place an hour later, spread out at the kitchen table with vendor lists, social media screenshots, and Eli's battered notebook. His handwriting looked like the plans to a siege. Arrows, circles, boxes marking critical points. "What do you want them to feel on the day?" he asked. "Cornered," I said. "Exposed. But not until everyone's watching." Eli tapped his pen on the table. "All right, I've got 2 ideas. First, we leak the caterer downgrade to a few foodie guests. Let it sound like a rumor, and by the time they taste the chicken instead of filet mignon, they'll be whispering at every table. Second, we make sure the vendor issues hit social media during the reception." "How?" "I've got someone who can accidentally post behind-the-scenes photos. Empty buffet trays, wilting flowers, that kind of thing, and tag the venue. People love that kind of gossip." It was surgical. Subtle enough that I wouldn't have to lift a finger on the day itself, but visible enough to erode the image Daniel and Maya had been selling for months. After Eli left, I sat for a while with my old photo albums. Not the ones Daniel would remember, the ones from before he was born. Me and Claire, my late wife, before the hospital rooms and insurance fights. She had a smile that could cut through any bad day, a way of looking at you like you were the only person in the room. I thought about what she'd say if she saw me now. Maybe she'd tell me I was being cruel. Or maybe, and this was the thought that surprised me, she'd understand. She'd seen the way Daniel's ambition had twisted after she was gone, how he'd started measuring worth in bank accounts and business cards instead of people. I put the album away. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance. By Wednesday, the cracks were widening. Karen called again from Spokane. "I just heard from a friend. Daniel's been trying to convince people the wedding's still going to be perfect. But she said he looked exhausted. Not just tired, worn out. I pictured him at some cafe, nursing a coffee he didn't taste, scanning his phone for bad news he couldn't stop." That same afternoon, Eli sent me a short video, shaky, like it had been shot secretly. Daniel was pacing outside the estate, phone pressed to his ear, his voice sharp. You couldn't hear every word, but contract breach and lawsuit came through clear. "This is the kind of footage that works wonders if it lands in the right inbox," Eli texted. I didn't respond right away. I just watched it again, noting how Daniel's eyes kept darting toward the parking lot, like he was afraid someone might be watching. Thursday, 2 days before the wedding, I made my last direct move. I called the estate, asked for Cassandra, and introduced myself. "Mr. Whitaker," she said after a pause, "we've heard a lot about you." "I'm sure you have," I said. "Listen, I'm not here to cause trouble for you. But you should know, I was never invited to this wedding. The bill they sent me was the first I'd heard of it. There was a beat of silence. Then, "That explains a lot." "I thought it might," I said. "So if there are any last-minute disruptions, just know they didn't come from me." It was the closest I'd come to a confession, but also a promise. To myself, not to her. That my fingerprints wouldn't be on whatever happened next. Friday night, the eve of the wedding, Portland was washed in cold rain again. I sat at the kitchen table with Eli, going over the plan one last time. "The leak goes out when the reception starts," he said. "Your family gossip network will be primed to notice every little imperfection. And our people in the vendor crews will be ready with their phones." I nodded. "And the vows?" Eli grinned. "Already taken care of." I raised an eyebrow. "You'll see," he said. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the rain. For the first time, I wondered what I'd feel when it was over. Relief? Satisfaction? Or just emptiness? But that was for later. Tomorrow was the day Daniel had built his life around, and I was going to make sure it was the day he remembered for all the wrong reasons. The morning of November 9th came with the kind of sky that promises trouble. Heavy clouds hung low over Portland, the air sharp with the smell of rain, though the storm hadn't broken yet. I was up before dawn, pacing the kitchen with a mug of black coffee, the house too quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock. Today was the day. Not just Daniel's wedding day, the day every move Eli and I had made for the last month would come to fruition. My phone buzzed at 6:14 a.m. On site, Eli's text read. Vendors setting up. Already tension. I set the phone down, staring out the window at the gray morning. I wasn't going anywhere near Sonoma. That was the beauty of it. I didn't have to be there to watch it burn. Eli was my eyes, my ears, and my matchstick. An hour later, the first photo came through. The grand lawn of the Willow Crest estate, supposed to be a pristine tableau for the outdoor cocktail hour, was a mess of puddles and mud from an overnight drizzle. Workers were laying plywood sheets for guests to walk on. Not a disaster, not yet, but enough to plant the first seed of disappointment. Another text. Florist short 2 staff. Half the arrangements missing. I smiled into my coffee. That had been one of our earliest moves, and it was paying off. By mid-morning, the messages were coming faster. Jazz Quartet's replacement is a single keyboard player. Maya's furious. Caterer delivering chicken and ribs. Guests already whispering. Photographer stuck in traffic, 45 minutes late. At 11:07, Eli sent a short video. Daniel, standing in the center of the ballroom, phone pressed to his ear, voice raised. You couldn't hear the words over the bustle, but his body language told the whole story. Pacing tight circles, free hand cutting the air in sharp motions. I forwarded the clip to Karen. Make sure this gets around, I wrote. By noon, the storm finally broke over Sonoma. Rain hammered the estate's slate roof, turning the plywood walkways into slippery hazards. Guests began arriving early, clutching umbrellas and looking for places to wait out the downpour. Eli's texts read like dispatches from a battlefield. Reception space still not ready. Maya's makeup smudged. She's crying in the bridal suite. Daniel yelling at the estate staff about towels. At 2:15 p.m., I got the message I'd been waiting for. Vows switched. Ready when they are. This had been Eli's idea, and I hadn't asked for details, plausible deniability, but I knew it involved the printed vow cards Daniel and Maya had given the officiant earlier in the week. While I waited, I poured myself a bourbon despite the early hour and sat in the living room, watching the rain sheet down the windows. Then the call came. It was Karen, her voice low but alive with electricity. "Robert, I don't know what just happened, but during the vows, Daniel started reading. And it wasn't vows. It was a transcript. Something about bills and, 'You should be grateful I'm letting you contribute.'" People gasped. I sat back, the glass warm in my hand. And he froze. Tried to laugh it off, said it was a joke, but Maya was glaring like she could kill him. Then someone in the back, I swear it was one of her uncles, said, "Guess the rumors are true." I could picture it. The perfect, curated moment shattered in front of every guest. Not long after, Eli sent me the proof. A grainy video from a phone. Daniel, standing at the altar, holding a small cream-colored card. He started confidently, but his expression shifted as he scanned the words. The camera caught a close-up. The last line, in his own handwriting, from the original invoice he'd sent me. "You should be grateful I'm letting you contribute." The guests' murmurs filled the background. Maya's face went rigid, her bouquet trembling in her hands. I didn't need to see more. The reception was no better. Eli's updates came rapid fire. Half the buffet gone in 20 minutes. Chicken cold. Centerpieces missing from a third of the tables. Guests leaving early because of the weather. Hashtag John Willowcrest Wedding trending locally, mostly mocking. By 6:30, Karen called again. "They're trying to dance, but the floor's slick from people tracking in rainwater. Daniel looks like he's ready to bite someone. Maya's in the bathroom with her bridesmaids. Rumor is they're fighting." I sat in my quiet house, listening to the clock tick, feeling no need to rush the moment. Every piece had fallen exactly where it needed to. At 8:02, Eli sent the final update of the night. They're leaving early. No send-off, no bouquet toss. Just gone. The rain outside my window had eased to a mist, the streetlights casting long, wet reflections on the pavement. I took the last sip of my bourbon, set the glass down, and let the silence settle over me. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I just felt finished. The morning after the wedding, Portland woke under a pale, washed-out sky. The rain had passed in the night, leaving the streets slick and shining, as if the city had been scrubbed clean. I made coffee the way I always do, slow pour-over, 2 scoops of beans I grind myself, and sat at the kitchen table with the paper. But I wasn't really reading. My phone was face down beside the mug, because I knew once I turned it over, there'd be no going back. At 7:42 a.m., it buzzed. "Eli, it's everywhere." I flipped it over. The first link was to a local lifestyle blog out of Sonoma. "Chaos at Willowcrest, the wedding that went sideways." The article wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. It described logistical issues, guest confusion, and unexpected tension during the ceremony. There were a few blurry photos. Daniel with that frozen half-smile, Maya clutching her bouquet too tightly, empty chairs visible in the background. Eli's next text was a screenshot from Instagram. The hashtag Willowcrest Wedding was trending in Portland and Sonoma. The top posts weren't flattering. A shot of the buffet with half-empty trays and the caption, "Guess lobster was out of season." A video of guests huddled under umbrellas in the rain, the sound of someone laughing in the background. A meme. Someone had grabbed a still from the vow sabotage video. Daniel's confused face frozen mid-word, with the text, "You should be grateful." I scrolled for a while, the coffee cooling in my hands. Then Karen called. "Well," she said without preamble, "you made your point." "Did I?" I asked. "Oh, honey, people are calling it a disaster. I've had 3 different people text me links to that vows video. They all say the same thing. They've never seen Daniel so small. I didn't answer. Karen went on. Maya's family is furious. Apparently, her mother's blaming Daniel for everything. Says he embarrassed them in front of their friends. Half her side of the family left before dessert. After we hung up, I stood at the kitchen window for a long time, looking at the wet street. The way the light hit the puddles. It should have felt like victory. And in a way, it did. But there was also a weight to it. Not regret exactly, but a sense of how final it all was. Eli came by that afternoon, still riding the high. "You've seen it, right?" he said, dropping into the chair across from me. That vows video has over 10,000 views between Instagram and TikTok, and it's not stopping. Someone even slowed it down and added dramatic music. I shook my head, but I couldn't help a small, dry chuckle. "They're going to feel this for a long time," Eli said. "Vendors won't want to work with them. Their social circle's going to shrink fast." He wasn't wrong. By evening, I'd gotten 2 more calls. One from an old co-worker who'd heard Daniel lost a potential client. Another from a neighbor who swore she'd seen Maya alone at a coffee shop, looking like she'd been crying. That night, I poured myself a bourbon and sat in the living room, the TV off, the house quiet. I thought about the first time Daniel had ever asked me for money. He was 19, in college, and wanted a new laptop. I'd scraped together the cash, even though the one he had was perfectly fine. He'd thanked me then, sincerely, back before the gratitude had turned into expectation. I thought about Claire, too. How she would have hated seeing him this way, but also how she'd have understood why I did what I did. The next day, Monday, the messages from Daniel started. Short at first. "We need to talk. Why are you doing this? You've ruined everything." I didn't respond. By Tuesday, the tone had shifted. "Dad, please. We can fix this if you'll just stop." I stared at the last one for a long time. Fix this. As if the problem was the fallout, not the arrogance that caused it. That evening, Eli called. They're back in Portland, staying with one of Maya's friends. I heard Daniel's been trying to get meetings to do damage control. Nobody's biting. I leaned back in my chair, the phone warm against my ear. Then it's done. There was a pause. "You sure?" Eli asked. I was quiet for a beat. "Yeah, I'm sure." When I hung up, I realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. The tension I'd been carrying since that first envelope arrived was gone. In its place was something steadier. Not joy, not regret, just closure. By Wednesday afternoon, 3 days after the wedding, I thought the noise had finally started to die down. The memes weren't coming as fast. The hashtags were slipping from the trending list. My phone had been quiet for hours, which felt like a strange luxury after the last few weeks. Then there was a knock at the door. Not the polite 2-tap kind. This was harder, heavier, a sound that carried impatience in every thud. I knew before I even reached the entryway. Through the frosted glass, I could make out 2 shapes. Daniel in a suit that had lost its press, hair damp from the mist outside. Beside him, Maya, wrapped in a beige coat, eyes locked somewhere on the porch boards. When I opened the door, the cold air rushed in with them. "We need to talk," Daniel said, stepping inside before I could answer. Maya followed, silent, her perfume faint but sharp in the narrow hallway. I closed the door, leaning against it. "You're here now, so talk." He turned to face me, hands in his pockets, shoulders tight. "What you did?" "What I did?" I cut in. "You mean what you started when you sent me an $80,000 invoice for a wedding I wasn't invited to?" His jaw flexed. I was trying to give us the wedding we deserved." "No," I said. "You were trying to give yourself the wedding you thought other people would envy. There's a difference." Maya shifted her weight, still not meeting my eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "It wasn't supposed to go like that." "Like what?" I asked. "The vows," she said, glancing briefly at Daniel. "The rumors. Everyone leaving early." "That was all a result of choices you both made," I said. Daniel's voice sharpened. "Don't pretend you weren't behind it. The vendors dropping out. The gossip. That stunt during the ceremony." I didn't deny it. "You humiliated yourself when you put those words on paper in the first place. All I did was hold up a mirror." The room went quiet. I could hear the faint hum of the fridge, the ticking of the clock in the kitchen. Finally, Daniel said, "Do you have any idea how much damage you've done? My reputation—" "Your reputation," I said, stepping closer, "was already fragile. All I did was show people what was underneath. Maybe now you'll start building on something real." He looked away, his throat working like he was swallowing something back. Maya finally met my gaze then. There was no anger in her eyes, just something hollow. "We lost deposits, friends, my parents. They're ashamed. Maybe you'll remember that feeling next time you decide who matters in your life," I said. For a moment, none of us moved. Then Daniel's voice softened, almost too low to hear. "You could have just said no." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "I've said no to you plenty of times. You never listened. You needed something you couldn't ignore." His eyes met mine for the first time. And for just a flicker, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. The boy from that Little League photo, the one who used to think I could fix anything. But the moment passed. He straightened, his tone cooling. "I guess we're done here." I didn't stop him as he turned for the door. Maya followed, her coat brushing against the frame as they stepped into the gray afternoon. From the doorway, I watched them walk down the path to a car I didn't recognize. Daniel didn't look back. Maya did once, a small glance over her shoulder, her expression unreadable, before she got in. The car pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the damp haze. Inside, the house felt even quieter than before. I went to the kitchen, poured the last of the morning's coffee into my mug, and stood at the window. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel guilty. What I felt was settled. Like a book had closed, not with a snap, but with a slow, final turn of the page. Eli called later that evening. "So, how'd it go?" "They came, we talked, or something close to it. And it's over," I said. He didn't push for details. "Then I'll raise a glass to that." After we hung up, I sat in the living room with the lights low, the street outside shining under the glow of the lamps. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting for the next move. There wasn't one. The game was finished. 2 weeks after that gray Wednesday, when Daniel and Maya stood in my hallway, the leaves in Portland had turned from damp gold to brittle brown. The last storms of November had blown most of them into the gutters, where they clung in wet clumps. Life had gone quiet again. The first few days after they left, I kept half expecting another knock at the door, another voicemail, another text in all caps. But none came. The silence, once so heavy between us, now felt permanent, not as a wound, but as a fact. I still got the occasional update. Karen heard from someone in Spokane that Daniel and Maya had canceled their honeymoon altogether. Eli passed along a rumor that the Willow Crest estate had blacklisted them for unprofessional conduct, a phrase that, in wedding world terms, is a scarlet letter. And of course, the internet never forgets. Every so often, A new comment would pop up on one of those vow sabotage clips, someone stumbling onto it weeks later and adding another layer of mockery. But the frenzy had died down. It left me with a lot of stillness. I used it. I went back to habits I'd let slide, morning walks along the river, tinkering with the old Chevy in the garage, cooking dinners that took more than one pot. The first Sunday in December, I even dug out my fishing gear from the attic and drove to the coast. On the drive back, I thought about Claire, how she'd have rolled her eyes at the whole mess, but then set a cup of tea in front of me and said, "Well, Robert, at least you finally stood your ground." I also thought about Daniel, not the man in the suit, jaw clenched, muttering about reputation, but the boy who used to fall asleep in the passenger seat on the way home from baseball games, still smelling of dust and grass. The boy who once told me I was the strongest person he knew. It's strange how memory can feel like both a gift and a blade. I knew I hadn't destroyed him. He'd rebuild, maybe smaller, maybe humbler, or maybe not. That wasn't mine to control anymore. What I'd done was simple. I'd drawn a line he couldn't step over without consequences. One cold Thursday evening, a card came in the mail. Plain white envelope, no return address. Inside, "Dad, I don't know where we go from here, but I heard you." D, no apology, no excuses, just that. I set it on the mantel, beside the framed Little League photo. Not as a trophy, but as a marker. Proof that for the first time in years, he'd chosen to write without asking for anything. Maybe that was a start, maybe not. The night I got the card, I poured a bourbon and sat at the kitchen table with the lights low. Outside, the rain had started again, soft and steady against the windows. I thought about everything that had happened. The envelope on my table that morning weeks ago, the quiet rage that turned into resolve, the careful dismantling of an event I'd been excluded from. If there's a lesson in it, it's not about revenge. It's about dignity, about knowing where your worth ends and someone else's demands begin. I'd spent years letting Daniel set the terms between us. That ended the day I chose not to pay for a seat I wasn't even allowed to sit in. The bourbon was smooth, the house warm, the air filled with the faint hum of the heater. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something. I'd already had my say, and that was enough.